Hello, my name's Sue Palmer and I write fiction for children. My latest project is the May's Moon trilogy, which tells the story of 13-year-old Michael May's dream of becoming the first child astronaut. He enters a competition run by NASA along with 9 other children, but there can only be one winner. And some of the children seem to be prepared to do almost anything to win. And the question is Michael? So I thought I'd read for you today the first chapter of May's Moon to give you an idea of what the story is about. Click. Michael May fastened the last strap on his spacesuit and lifted on his helmet. Primary life support system secure? Shouted the bald-headed man in front of him. Check. Helmet secure? Check. Suit sealer secure? Check. Michael looked around the hangar. Forget Tom Hill's dream of driving a Bugatti Veyron. Forget Darren Fletcher fantasising about playing left wing for Chelsea. This had to beat the whole lot. For the first time in his life, Michael wished that everyone could see him. Give me a thumbs up, y'all, when you're ready, said the bald-headed man in uniform. Then I'll start up the pumps. Any problems, just put up your hand and we'll stop. As the words still echoed, Michael's legs wobbled underneath him. What if he wasn't any good? What if he messed it up? This wasn't just a dream anymore. He really was in America, and he really was just about to find out what it felt like to float in space. 10 gloved thumbs rose into the air, and 10 helmets momentarily glanced up to a balcony surrounded by a smoked glass screen. Standing behind it were a huddle of adults wearing half smiles, scanning every movement below them. Michael filled his lungs slowly, staring at the water stretching out in front of him. His heart thumped like a jackhammer. Surely everyone could hear it. Suddenly, black fans, sounding like giant microwaves, started to whir in each corner of the hangar. Bob Sturton, who was in charge, gave his next command. I want you all to move to the edge of the pool now, and then I'm going to turn on the oxygen to your umbilicals. With help, Michael and the other children shuffled to the poolside like giant white penguins. A few seconds later, a rush of cool air flooded into his helmet. Michael almost gulped it. This is the most important piece of equipment for you guys, said Bob, picking up a curly tube that led from the back of Michael's spacesuit to a silver box on the wall. This is your primary life support system, or umbilical as we call it. This is where your communication and oxygen come from, and it must not, under any circumstances, get twisted. When you get down there, you'll see your support divers. These guys are going to be watching you the whole time and are there to help if you get into any trouble. Any problems, remember to put your hand up and they'll come straight to you. Michael started running through the briefing they'd all had the day before, trying to remember as much as he could. The building they were in now contained something called a neutral buoyancy pool. Bob had explained to Michael and the 9 others in his group that this was one of the world's largest indoor pools. Longer and wider than an Olympic-sized swimming pool, it was also 5 times deeper and could hold an entire shuttle cargo bay in it. Bob looked at his watch and then lifted his arm to signal the start. One at a time, the children inched forwards, then stepped from the poolside onto a square platform suspended from a yellow crane by 4 metal wires. A loud beeping, which reminded Michael of a lorry reversing, rang around the hangar as barriers jolted down on each side of the platform. With another signal from Bob, it started to lower towards the water. Michael's chest suddenly tightened and his gloves grew damp inside. He couldn't let it affect him now. He just couldn't. He would soon be below the surface, and anyway, he was in a spacesuit this time. The water couldn't get to him. Deep breaths. Take long, deep breaths, he thought. The jackhammer began to slow, and by the time Michael was completely submerged, his breathing was calm again. He hadn't prepared himself for what it would look like underwater, but his eyes widened immediately. He'd seen pictures and video footage of all 135 space shuttle launches since the very first in 1981, and he knew what every inch of every shuttle looked like. But to actually have part of a space shuttle below him right now? Wicked, he mouthed, before twisting around to see the same look of amazement on the others' faces. Bob's voice suddenly boomed in Michael's earpiece. Great job, guys. As you can see, today we have a mock-up of a space shuttle cargo bay. It's floating approximately 15 metres below you in a tank containing 28 million litres of water. An exact replica of the Atlantis shuttle cargo bay. It measures 18.3 metres long by 4.6 metres wide. Wow, this thing would be able to fit in a whole fleet of Tom Hill's Bugattis, or give Darren Fletcher enough space to imagine he was taking a penalty at Stamford Bridge. Once you give me the okay, I'm going to get you down to the shuttle, and then the divers will adjust your weights to make you neutrally buoyant. Now, who can tell me what neutrally buoyant means? Asked Bob. A voice answered immediately. Michael recognised it as Buddy, one of the 4 Americans here. They'd only known each other for 2 days, but Michael was already hoping that Buddy would become a friend. Short, with dark hair and an evil sense of humour, Buddy was one of those boys who could get away with anything. This was impressive. Michael's teacher, Mrs. Jarvis, seemed to have eyes in the back of her head. The moment he tried to do something he shouldn't, he'd hear her parrot voice shout his name, and she'd wave her spindly figure at his chair. Neutral buoyancy is the equal tendency of an object to sink or float, recited Buddy with a drawl that made Michael picture cowboy films. If a combination of weights and floats are used to make an item neutrally buoyant, it will seem to almost hover under the water. This makes moving even heavy objects easy, just like it is in space. Great job, Buddy, said Bob. Right, are you guys ready to begin? Goosebumps immediately erupted over Michael's arms and neck. He lifted his right thumb up to answer Bob. This was one of the pools where American astronauts trained for spacewalks. They had to put in between 7 and 10 hours of training for each hour they were going to spend outside their spacecraft. It was the closest thing to weightlessness that you could get, and he was just about to experience it. The other children all gave a thumbs up, and the hoist supporting them carried on its descent to the shuttle. Michael kept looking down as they went deeper and deeper, and apart from the sound of his breathing, there was silence. It's not deep water, he thought. It's just a nice warm bath. There's nothing to worry about. He knew that the water had been heated to something like 28 degrees Celsius to protect the divers, and had half expected to feel the warmth of the water. But in his spacesuit, the temperature stayed exactly the same. Little by little, the blurry shapes below became clearer, and the colossal shuttle cargo bay came into focus. There was a sudden jolt, and the platform came to a halt. The divers then reappeared and busied themselves removing the barriers from the hoist and adjusting the children's weights. From the surface, Bob relayed his next instruction. Right, guys, we went through this yesterday in the classroom and you've all walked through it on dry land. Now it's time to see what you're made of. Michael, tell me what the payload bay is and what it's used for. Michael said nothing. Michael, did you hear me? There was silence for a few seconds more as Michael tried to order the jumble in his head. This is exactly how he felt at home when he was asked to stand up and regurgitate the periodic table. A payload is another name for cargo or goods that are being delivered or transported, he said in a rush. The payload bay is where these goods, like satellites or lab equipment, are carried. Excellent, Michael, shouted Bob. Perfect. Now, Tilly, what is the space arm and what does it do? A confident, high-pitched American voice answered. A space arm is the remote manipulator arm on a shuttle. It's a kind of robotic arm used to lift payload out of or into the cargo bay. Good job, Tilly, said Bob. You guys really know your stuff. So you all understand that you each have 3 tasks to perform. First, you need to locate the satellite and use the space arm to pick it up. Then you must manoeuvre it into the cargo bay, and finally you need to show me that you can close the cargo bay doors. Anyone who fails to complete all 3 tasks is going home. Give me a thumbs up if you understand and you're happy to go on. The word home made Michael's stomach turn. He'd only just got here and had absolutely no intention of going home, not if he could help it. He'd wondered how Bob could possibly see them 15 metres down in the pool until he noticed that one of the divers floating in front of them was holding a video camera. So all their mistakes were going to be recorded then. The children had partners to work with, and Michael had been paired up with Will Bradley Jr. Will was the loudest in the group and a bit of a joker. Michael wasn't at all sure about him. He came from Washington, D.C., but apart from that, Michael only knew 2 other things about him. He was a year older than Michael at 14, and he had 3 older brothers. Michael just hoped that Will was as good at listening as he was at talking, and could remember the briefing from the day before. You have 2 hours to complete your task, and your time starts now, instructed Bob through their earpieces. Michael began immediately by pressing the communications button on the left side of his helmet. This gave him a separate radio channel to talk to his partner. Will, are you ready? Sure am, replied Will. Let's go and find the first satellite and then we can work out how we're going to get it into position for the space arm, suggested Michael. And with a nod from Will, the 2 boys made a move towards the edge of the platform. Michael watched his partner's slow motion movements. It looked like Will was trying to wade through quicksand. Michael tried to jump off the platform to follow him, but toppled forwards. Whoa! He shouted, trying to steady himself. Will, this is weird, isn't it? When I move, it feels like someone's pressed the half-speed button on my remote control. Will swung around slowly. Yeah, it's freaky. You look like just like Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin did in the footage of the moon landing. Do you remember what they said? Of course I do, answered Michael, surprised at the easy question. 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind. No, not that. I mean the bit where Buzz Aldrin said that it took him 3 or 4 steps to get the hang of walking on the moon. Michael eventually managed to get a rhythm going, and the 2 boys made their way to a thin white metal rail. This is impossible, thought Michael, as he tried to wrap his glove around it. Although he could feel his fingers and move them, the pressure in his spacesuit made it so difficult to grab hold of anything tightly. This is why astronauts always look so clumsy, he thought. Over there, look, said Will suddenly as they came to the middle of the pool. When Michael looked to where Will was pointing, he saw a cluster of large white dishes. They looked like giant pasta bowls, said Michael, smiling. I wouldn't mind having my dinner in one of those. Let's check for the right one, though. Bob said they've all got serial numbers on them. Can you remember the number, said Will, his voice telling Michael that he had absolutely no idea. Easy, said Michael. It's the first part of my granny's telephone number. 862. It's not this one then, said Will, reading the 3 numbers from a metal plate on the back of the first satellite dish. Nor this one, said Michael, looking at a second dish nearby. It took the boys several minutes of bobbing around like puppets before they found the right satellite. "Got it," shouted Michael when he saw the familiar numbers. "Right, let's put something on it so we can find it again." He removed a carabiner clip with an orange tag on it from his belt and attached it to one of the metal struts of the satellite dish. "Okay, now we've got to get to the space arm and try to lift this thing up to the payload bay," said Will, motioning for Michael to follow him. By now the pool was crowded. There were divers swimming around, 9 other children floating in big spacesuits, and a camera stuck in front of them the whole time. But to Michael it was all strangely calm. Perhaps it was because he could hear nothing but Will. Perhaps it was because he could only move slowly in his cumbersome spacesuit. Or perhaps it was because, for the first time, he knew what he was doing. "I can't breathe," rasped a tiny, wobbly voice suddenly in Michael's other ear. "What was that?" said Michael, swinging around as fast as his suit would allow. "Someone must have pressed the emergency radio button to get hold of Bob on the surface. That's the only way we'd be able to hear someone else's voice," said Will. It sounded like Aiko's voice, but Michael couldn't be sure, and he couldn't see her anywhere near him. "Aiko, this is Bob," came a familiar drawl over the radio. "Now I want you to listen to me. You must have your umbilical caught on something and it's stopping the flow of oxygen to your helmet. Put up your hand and stay exactly where you are, and one of my guys will be with you straight away." "But I can't breathe. Help me," pleaded the frantic voice. Michael looked above and below him and turned around 360 degrees as fast as he could before he saw blurred shapes thrashing about back over by the satellites. "Hold on, Aiko," shouted Michael, pressing his emergency radio button and pushing off with his left foot in her direction. What he'd read about spacewalking was completely true, he thought, as he tried to get some momentum going. It was as though his brain was working at full speed, but his body could only operate at half speed in his spacesuit. "Come on, legs!" In 3 or 4 kangaroo-type hops, Michael was close enough to see that someone else had beaten him to it, and he stopped. It took him a moment to realise. Whoever it was wasn't helping Aiko. They were moving away. There were no support divers in sight, and Aiko was now floating limply on her side. Michael toppled forwards again, trying to keep his balance. He wrapped his glove around her arm and shook it, looking through her visor. Her eyes were closed. "Wake up, Aiko. It's me, Michael. Tell me what to do." "Look around her, Michael," directed Bob's calm voice over his radio. "There will be an umbilical coming out of the back of her spacesuit just below her waist. Make sure it's still connected and then follow it up as far as you can see to see if it's caught or twisted. My divers will be with you any second, but it sounds like we don't have much time." Michael hesitated. What should he do? Why had he got himself involved? What if he couldn't help her? He grabbed her and spun her around as fast as he could to see if the oxygen tube had become detached. "Bob, the tube is in, okay?" Michael grasped Aiko's oxygen tube as tightly as he could and gently pulled himself up on it. Up and up he went. He wasn't sure how far he'd gone before he found it. "I've got it. The tube's caught on one of the ladders on the outside of the shuttle. It must have twisted as Aiko went down deeper." With a quick flick, Michael released the tube from the ladder and unwound the twisted section. He looked beneath him to see if there was any response from Aiko, but there was nothing. By now the divers had reached her and were kicking as fast as they could to take her up to the surface. They passed Michael, who couldn't do anything other than stare, and then disappeared above him. "Don't worry, Michael," came Bob's voice. "You tried your best. Just leave Aiko to us now." But how could he not worry? If this sort of thing could happen in a pool, with people all around, what could happen tens of thousands of miles away in space? And who had he seen swimming away from Aiko instead of helping? After what seemed like an age of just floating there and thinking about what had just happened, Michael suddenly heard Bob's voice. "It's okay, Michael. Aiko's back with us. She just passed out, but she's fine now, thanks to you. But you need to get on. You can't afford to lose any more time." Michael blinked away the wetness in his eyes and made his way back to Will. Suddenly, all the things he was used to worrying about at school and home seemed really unimportant. "Well done, Mike," said Will, giving his partner a pat on the back. It looked like Iko was a goner. Michael usually hated anyone calling him Mike. At home, he'd pinch his little sister Millie if she ever called him that. He hated it even more when Darren Fletcher and some of the others at school teased him about his love of space by calling him Mickey Moon. But when Will called him Mike, there was something different about it. Will didn't know about any of the other stuff, and it sounded okay. "Do you remember what Bob said about the space arm?" asked Will as he and Michael moved off again. It'll be attached to one of the ports on the outside of the shuttle body," said Michael, pointing ahead of them. "But this time, instead of using panel switches and the shuttle computer to move the arm electronically, we've got to use the hand controllers." "That's going to be the tricky bit," replied Will. "I didn't do very well in training. I'm not into video games or stuff like that, and I was garbage with the controls." "Don't worry," said Michael, nudging Will's shoulder. "I've played tons of games and all sorts of machines. I'll move the arm and you get down to the satellite and make sure I get hold of it properly, okay?" When the boys reached the shuttle, their heads were level with its underside. "Looks like the belly of some huge white whale," said Will, lifting his arm up to touch it. "Amazing," was all that came from Michael's mouth as he looked up. For as long as he could remember, he'd loved looking at pictures and models of space shuttles. It didn't matter which bit of the shuttle he was looking at. He loved it all. For his 9th birthday, he got the best present ever from his Auntie Joyce and Uncle Malcolm, a plastic click model of the Challenger space shuttle. The following birthday came a model of the Enterprise, which took him and his uncle the whole day and evening to glue together. Columbia and Discovery shuttles followed, and for his last birthday, he'd received a scale model of the Atlantis shuttle, complete with balsa wood frame, tissue paper covering, model cement, white glue, and a modelling knife. This kit was a professional one though, so he needed some help building it. Perhaps now things had changed at home, his dad would have time to finish it with him. Will's voice suddenly interrupted Michael's daydream. "Come on, buddy, let's get on. We have to find the port with the space arm attached to it." "You go that way," he said, pointing to the left, "and I'll go this. Shout if you find anything." They moved apart and started scanning the underside of the shuttle, trying to see where the space arm had been attached. The diver with the camera was right next to him as he was doing this, and Michael noticed that the clock on the top of the camera read 1:20. "Will," he called, his voice wavering, "we've only got 40 minutes left to complete this or we fail. Come on, we've got to find the space arm, and fast." So thank you for listening to the first chapter of May's Moon, and I hope you enjoyed it.